So we are in our fifth session in our study of the Call of the Divine Beloved. And for the last several weeks, we've been investigating one of the valleys of the seven valleys. And this week, we're looking at the Valley of Unity. So we're at the midpoint of the seven valleys. And this midpoint we'll find is a real pivot around which the seven valleys turn. And also, this Valley of Unity is the longest and most complex of the valleys, as it is also in Baha'u'llah's Gems of Divine Mysteries. So we'll see if we can get through all of it in 1 week. It might take a little bit longer. But just to briefly maybe recapitulate where we are at this point, the overarching thesis that I would put forward is that what Baha'u'llah is doing in these mystical tablets, apart from re-expressing some timeless spiritual truths about the nature of the spiritual journey, is that Baha'u'llah is also preparing the way for something at a social level. This isn't simply an individual journey through degrees of spiritual attainment, but it is groundwork that's being prepared for a collective transformation of consciousness. And Baha'u'llah in the Tablet of Unity, this is such a pivotal, in the Valley of Unity, this is such a pivotal valley in the seven valleys, because it's in this valley that Baha'u'llah identifies the root causes of human suffering and conflict in the world. At least that suffering and conflict which is caused by other humans. If there's suffering and conflict in the world, it's just caused by our being in a state of nature and being subject to all sorts of forces that are beyond our control, which also cause suffering. But the root of human conflict, Baha'u'llah identifies here in this valley, and also gestures in the direction of the solution, or perhaps even more than that, really gives us the keys to the solution. And the solution, as we can imagine, is not simple, because just as it's taken us generations, millennia, to get to the state of society that we're in, the state of deep divisions and conflicts that exist in the world today, they're not going to be solved overnight. They're not going to be solved in a generation. We're talking about generational solution to these problems of conflict, where we set the wheels in motion, and maybe our children's children will start seeing the effect of it. So what we're doing in this valley is pivoting from the valleys of limitation, the stages of limitation, to the stations of unity. And just as in last week we found it helpful in the Valley of Knowledge to look at the underlying terminology behind the word, because just the word knowledge gives us immediately an idea of say book learning, whereas in the Valley of Knowledge, the word ma'rifat really implies something more like intuition. Similarly here, the word for unity, there's actually different words for unity that mean different things, and all of which can be translated as unity in English. And so there's a complexity in the underlying terminology where it's helpful to look at the original words. It doesn't always solve the problem, but it can be helpful. In this case, the word for unity here is tawheed, which typically means, it is interpreted as divine unity or the unity of God. It's often considered the fundamental pillar or principal teaching of Islam, the strong monotheism underlying Islam, which also is arguably a core teaching in in Judaism and Christianity as well. And so the word here is tawheed. Although when one comes across the word unity in English, in translations of Baha'i literature, one also finds other words can be translated as unity, which mean very different things. So, for example, there's the word ettihad, which also is translated as unity. But usually that means unity in the human realm. You're talking about absence of conflict and the coming together of people. But ettihad and tawheed are both based on the same root. They're both based on the same triliteral root in Arabic, which then got passed into the Persian. And that triliteral root is W-H with a dot under it and D, wahda. And there are further words for unity also. There's, for example, wahidiyya and ahadiyya, which we've discussed in previous weeks, which also refer to different degrees of unity when one is talking about the divine. There are other words also that can be translated as unity. For example, which are based on a different triliteral root. There's another root called FRD, farad, which means basically being single. And you have words based on that as well. Just as you have wahad and tawheed, you have farad and tafreed. So there are certain patterns that occur in the Arabic. And so you sometimes see the word tafreed or fardaniye in the original, which also can be translated as unity. So the point of all this is to say that there is a multiplicity of words in the original, which can be translated as unity or oneness or singleness, and you don't know which one it is without looking at the original. But even looking at the original, it won't always necessarily give you the answers to what exactly is meant by unity in this particular instance, because even their usages in the original can vary depending on context. So, for example, the word tawheed in the Seven Valleys is often used in other contexts as describing the unity of God, whereas here in the Seven Valleys, as Baha'u'llah uses the word tawheed, it seems as though he's describing more something about a unity of vision, something about the eye of the seeker and how the seeker is advancing beyond different stages of multiplicity to be able to see through the eye of unity. So that's just, I guess, a parenthetical comment on the complexity of some of the underlying terminology. So in the fourth valley, then, Baha'u'llah is using the word unity really with respect to the attainment of what one might call a spiritual Archimedean point. The seeker is trying to reach a point where they can see the entire forest as opposed to the individual trees, and then one sees the whole forest as a forest. That's one way, perhaps, of looking at this station of unity. But to see it in relation to the valleys that came before, one could perhaps try to sketch the valleys that we've traversed up until this point, as there's perhaps an initial valley that it's not even a valley that's described here but referred to. There's the valley or plains of heedlessness, where one has not even entered into a state of search. So there's no relationship to the divine. There's no relationship to reality, because one is not even aware that there's a reality to be searched for. Then the subsequent valleys all describe this evolving relationship of the seeker with reality. And the first valley described here is this valley of active searching, but not yet discovery. So the seeker realizes that there's something to be found, but has not yet found it. The first discovery of that thing which is found is the valley of love. And there's an identification of the thing that is sought, but there's still a tension of opposites which hasn't yet been resolved. And that tension of opposites is expressed in the pain of love. that valley is traversed into the valley of knowledge, in which the tension of the opposites is resolved. There's a resolution of the contrary of the contrary things. There's the ability to see the end and the beginning. There's the ability to see the lover and the beloved as one and the same, or at least to see the lover in the beloved and vice versa. But this valley of knowledge is still within the realm of plurality, and therefore the realm of limitation, because although one sees the end and the beginning are still two different things. And that ability to see the unity of opposites is transcendent in the next valley, which is the valley that we're addressing today, which is the valley of unity, in which one sees contraries not just as compatible, but as actually one. One sees no difference between the two opposites. And that is actually only the first station of unity, as Baha'u'llah says in this valley. And there's stations of unity beyond that, stations in which one is no longer really seeing even oneness. The idea of multiplicity versus oneness is transcended in still higher stations. We find as we progress through these valleys that there's an ascending ladder of degrees of abstraction. It becomes, the ground beneath our feet becomes less and less certain. It becomes less clear to us whether we really understand what it is Baha'u'llah is saying. And as Baha'u'llah himself says, particularly emphasizing in later valleys, there are certain secrets in these valleys that simply can't be spoken in words. There's certain realizations that are not capable of being encompassed by written text. It's almost as though each valley is describing a unique piece of music, and you can describe a musical composition by the chord progressions, by the nature of the music, all sorts of properties of a song. So one can have heard about a song in quite a great bit of detail and feel like one knows the song in a way because it's been described so fully. But unless you've heard the song, you don't really know the song. And I wonder if it's the same thing with the seven valleys. Baha'u'llah is describing each of the valleys, but each valley is kind of like a song. And if one hasn't heard the melody, if one hasn't heard the song in each of these valleys, then ultimately one is dealing with the words, and one is maybe coming to the right conclusions and maybe not. But there is a dimension of experience that is necessary to really understand what Baha'u'llah is talking about. But to dive into paragraph 35, which is describing what happens when this threshold is crossed, and he's describing this eye of unity that the seeker sees through. He says, after passing through the valley of knowledge, which is the last station of limitation, the wayfarer cometh to the first station of unity, and drinketh from the cup of oneness, and gazeth upon the manifestations of singleness. In this station he pierceth the veils of plurality, fleeth the realms of the flesh, and ascendeth unto the heaven of unity. With the ear of God he heareth, with the eye of God he beholdeth the mysteries of divine creation. He steppeth into the inner sanctuary of the friend, and as an intimate shareth the pavilion of the well-beloved. He stretcheth forth the hand of truth from the sleeve of the absolute, and revealeth the mysteries of divine power. He seeth in himself neither name, nor fame, nor rank, but findeth his own praise in the praise of God, and in the name of God beholdeth his own. To him all songs are from that sovereign King, and every melody from him. He sitteth on the throne of say all things are of God, and reclineth upon the seat of there is no power nor strength but in God alone. He looketh upon all things with the eye of unity, and seeth the effulgent rays of the Sun of Truth shining from the dayspring of the divine essence upon all created things alike, and beholdeth the lights of unity reflected upon all creation. The stretching forth the hand of truth from the sleeve of the absolute is an allusion to Moses, the hand of Moses, that from the Old Testament, God commanding Moses to stretch forth his hand, and one of the miracles of Moses was that his hand was shining white, and perhaps revealing the mysteries of divine power. Either there's a reference to that or other miracles of Moses. So there's an allusion there. I'll just mention as an aside, there's a beautiful song. You have it, gorgeous song by M.J. Sear that takes some of these verses and puts them to music, and also finishes with some verses a few paragraphs further on. And I'll send a link to that in the when this gets posted. But it's an absolutely transcendent song. Yeah.
It makes me cry. It's just
Yeah, it's one of those songs. So here Baha'u'llah is describing a state in which one is able to transcend differences. One is able to see that every melody is from God, that all songs are from the King, and one can imagine this not just as a personal vision or a personal realization, but as something which has broader implications and connotations. We're talking about reaching a state where one is able to accept and embrace certain kinds of diversity, which perhaps one wasn't able to embrace before. Other songs that one didn't recognize, one can now recognize are all from that sovereign King. How does one get to that state of seeing with the eye of unity and being able to transcend differences? It's through this vision of light that Baha'u'llah gives, this wonderful explanation of in the paragraphs that follow, which one might call a metaphysics of light. I'm not sure if that phrase exactly matches, but here's how Baha'u'llah describes it in the next couple of paragraphs. He says, "It is known to thine eminence that all the variations which the wayfarer in the stages of his journey beholdeth in the realms of being proceed from his own vision. We shall give an example of this, that the meaning may become fully clear. Consider the visible sun. Although it shineth with the same radiance upon all existence, and at the behest of the Lord of the revelation bestoweth light on all things, yet in each place it becometh manifest and sheddeth its bounty according to the potentialities of that place. For instance, in a mirror it reflecteth its own disk and shape, and this is due to the clarity of the mirror itself. Through a crystal it maketh fire to appear, and in other things it showeth only the effect of its shining, but not its full disk. And yet through that effect, by the command of the Creator, it traineth each thing according to the capacity of that thing, even as thou dost observe. In like manner, colors become visible in each object according to its nature. For instance, in a yellow glass, the rays shine yellow. In a white glass, they are white, and in a red glass, red rays are visible. These variations proceed from the object itself, not from the light. And if a place be shut away from the light, as by walls and a roof, it will be entirely bereft of the light of the sun, and deprived of its rays. Thus it is that certain feeble souls have confined the wide expanse of knowledge within the walls of self and passion, and beneath the cloak of ignorance and blindness, and have thereby veiled themselves from the light of the mystic sun and the mysteries of the eternal beloved. They have strayed far from the gem-like wisdom of the resplendent faith of the Lord of the messengers, and been shut out of the inner court of the All-Beauteous, and have been banished from the Kaaba of glory. Such is the worth of the people of this age." So when Baha'u'llah describes that this light which is bestowed upon all things, yet in each place it becometh manifest and sheddeth its bounty according to the potentialities of that place. In another place, Abdu'l-Baha describes the same sort of thing using, instead of the metaphor of light, he uses the metaphor of water, or the metaphor of rain. This is from one of Abdu'l-Baha's tablets. He says, "God's grace is like the rain that cometh down from heaven. The water is not bounded by the limitations of form, yet on whatever place it poureth down, it taketh on limitations, dimensions, appearance, shape, according to the characteristics of that place. In a square pool, the water, previously unconfined, becometh a square. In a six-sided pool, it becometh a hexagon. In an eight-sided pool, an octagon, and so forth. The rain itself hath no geometry, no limits, no form, but it taketh on one form or another according to the restrictions of its vessel. In the same way, the holy essence of the Lord God is boundless, immeasurable, but his graces and splendors become finite in the creatures because of their limitations. So I mentioned the phrase metaphysics of light because what seems to be suggested to me here is the idea of there being ultimately something which unites all the different expressions of let's say the divine attributes, and ultimately that is that in our inmost essence, all of us are like rays of light, or all of us are like different expressions or shapes of water. Another way of saying this, and this is stated in the Baha'i writings in several places, that fundamentally, if one asks into the substance of things, what is the fundamental substance of things? And there's something, a phrase that is used called the primal will, which is described sometimes as the primal will, sometimes it's described as the Holy Spirit. It is the middle tier in the three-tiered cosmology of the Baha'i writings, the top tier being that of the completely inaccessible and unknowable divine essence. The middle tier being that of the let's say of the emanation of that unknowable essence, and the bottom tier being the world of being. But what sustains the world of being, and what ultimately one can think of forms its substance, one can also almost think of the primal will as the ocean, and as all created things as being the waves and droplets of that ocean. Abdu'l-Baha in one of his tablets says, "The primal will, which is the realm of command, is the inner reality of all things, and all beings are therefore the manifestations of the divine will, not the manifestations of the divine essence and reality itself." And this is an echo, or can be seen as an echo of the idea of the Logos from the Gospel of John in the Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was from God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. There's an origin point, which is sometimes described as a word. Again, the primal will is also the primal word. The letters B and E that are joined and knit together throughout the Baha'i writings are an expression of that primal word, which is the will, which wills creation into being, and that will undergirds all things. That will is the inmost substance of all things. In that sense, everything shares a divine nature. And when one can pierce the veils of plurality and see the reality that lies underneath, one sees that behind every created being, there is something of the divine within it. And it's that vision of the seeker which is able to pierce those veils of plurality and see that spark of the divine which lies within, which Baha'u'llah describes in several of the hidden words as well. Within thee have I placed the essence of my light. The ability of the seeker to pierce those veils of plurality and see that common spark that everything shares. That's the spark of the primal will. That's the spark of that word which undergirds all things. Abdu'l-Baha says this in another way in one of his talks that he gave in America in 1912. He said, "All phenomena are realized through the divine bounty. And the explanation of true pantheistic statement and principle is that the phenomena of the universe find realization through the one power animating and dominating all things. and all things are but manifestations of its and bounty. So there's a sense of power, of motion, of the substrate of things is not a static, are not these static atoms. The way I suppose traditional scientific view of the world is that in its fundamental being, things are these stable atoms. But even the atoms are in constant motion. And similarly with the spiritual power which undergirds all things, there's an idea of motion. It's the operation of the will, that the will to consciousness, perhaps, not the will to power, as another famous philosopher has said, but the will to consciousness. In one of a talk that Abdu'l-Baha gave, so this is on the Order of a Pilgrim note, Abdu'l-Baha describes this connection of this undergirding power of things to the atoms of things and how it tends towards the upbuilding of matter. He says the atoms of the elements are predisposed to synthesis and composition according to the laws of nature. The cosmic spirit, the divine primal will, operates and creates in this manner. The primal will operates in the element, in the primal atom, as attraction and repulsion. On the next higher level, as organic life. Then as animal, vegetative, and finally as spiritual life, which is destined to rise to the super-spiritual. What develops is not the physical substratum, which actually exists from the beginning in its different kinds, each of which then develops only within its own kind to higher perfection, but rather does the cosmic spirit, the divine primal will, unfold within the creature just as the bud of a flower unfolds. Another way of saying this, and another way of reading Baha'u'llah's statements about light and being manifest in different objects in different ways, is that our fundamental substance can be thought of as different attributes. We're all woven of the attributes of the divine. This actually is an idea that was developed by Hooper Dunbar in an earlier class that he gave on the Seven Valleys in 1988, and he described it in this way. So this is a transcript from a piece of a talk that he gave back in '88. He said, material creation is woven out of the divine attributes. The sustaining patterns of everything that exists are derived from unique, distinctive combinations of the names and attributes of God. The human reality is the only reality that partakes of every one of the divine names and is the image and likeness of its maker. This places it at the apex of creation.
Would you say that again, please?
The human reality is the only reality that partakes of every one of the divine names and is the image and likeness of its maker. This places it at the apex of creation. Baha'u'llah says something very similar in the Kitab-i-Iqan. And at the apex of the world of humanity stands the perfect man, the manifestation, an archetype, an exemplar that is the perfect embodiment of all these names and attributes. Our individual realities are partial reflections of that total light that the manifestation of God mediates in the world of existence. When we begin to see the effects of these names in the things around us, it helps us to understand this concept. For instance, when you look at a tree, think of the divine names that are manifested in a tree: strength, steadfastness, beauty, growth, fruitfulness, unfoldment. We all reflect these attributes to various degrees. Baha'u'llah named some of his followers by the attributes of God. That's an interesting point. That when you think of what are the most common Persian Baha'i surnames, Sabet, steadfast, Rohani, spiritual. What are some other common Persian Baha'i surnames? Enlightened. So fun. They're all attributes of God. It's kind of an interesting fact that. Yes. Yeah. Irfan, both first and last names, they're very often attributes of God. Almost as though there's an idea that people concretize or our attributes become flesh, and that becomes reflected in the very names of people. And so that's just a suggestion of a way to read this idea of Baha'u'llah, about the light appearing in different objects according to the capacity of the objects. And he goes on later to say how this is the key to understanding how conflict arises in the world. How conflict arises in the world. And it ultimately arises through ignorance. Because if we realized that all these different colors and all these different ways that light reflect are all manifestations of that same power, which is light, but we don't realize that it's the same light that illuminates all of these objects, but they're just illuminated in different ways. We're looking at the colors, or we're looking at, as he describes, light passing through a lens causes fire to appear. In its highest level of organization, matter can focus the rays of light in a way that you can actually, create fire. Otherwise, it can shine through, crystals of various colors, and you see the rays of light, but now they take on the coloration of the stone that it's passing through. Some sort of stones are translucent, and the rays don't pass through it, but it still illuminates the stone to some degree, and you can tell that there's light shining through it. And then other stones are completely dark, and the light doesn't penetrate.
But it warms it.
But it warms it. There's a beautiful tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he describes this ascent of the sun of truth, and he says the sun is rising and the heat of it's rising to high noon, and he says, and the heat of it will stir even the creeping things beneath the earth, and although it is not for them to behold the light, yet shall they all be stirred into frenzied motion by the impact of its heat. So this light is everywhere, and it's affecting everything, but not everyone has the vision to see that there's something, that there's a unifying principle behind it all. And if one only looks at the places of appearance, then one is trapped in the realm of differentiation. One is trapped in the degrees of limitation. Baha'u'llah in paragraph 39 gives a bit of a glimpse of his own station, which he does in several places in the Seven Valleys, where he says, and if a nightingale soar beyond the clay of self and dwell in the rose bower of the heart, and in Arabian melodies, that's Arabic, and sweet Persian tones recount the mysteries of God, a single word of which quickeneth anew every lifeless form, and bestoweth the spirit of holiness upon every mouldering bone, thou wilt behold 1,000 claws of envy, and a myriad talons of hatred hunting after him, and striving with all their power to encompass his death. This is both describing and foreshadowing his own, the opposition to his own message. Yea, to the beetle a sweet fragrance seemeth foul, and to the man sick of a room a pleasant perfume availeth not. Wherefore hath it been said, for the guidance of the ignorant, cleanse thou the room from out thine head, and breathe the breath of God instead. Now he goes on and describes how the ignorance of the origin of the light is the cause of conflict and division. He says, in sum, the differences among objects have now been made plain. Thus, when the wayfarer gazeth only upon the place of appearance, that is, when he considereth only the glass, he seeth red and yellow and white. And so it is that conflict hath prevailed amongst men, and a darksome dust from limited souls hath settled over the world. Others gaze upon the effulgence of the light, while yet others have drunk the wine of oneness and see naught but the sun itself. He seems to be alluding here to two different stages of unity. There's the first stage of unity, which is gazing upon the effulgence, seeing that all things are united through this light that equally shines upon everything. But there's a level even beyond that, where one drinks from the wine of oneness and sees naught but the sun itself. As the wayfarers traverse these three differing planes, their understanding and their words differ accordingly, and hence the sign of conflict hath ever appeared on earth. For there are some who dwell on the plane of divine unity and speak of that world, and some inhabit the realms of limitation, and some the grades of self, while others are completely veiled. Thus do the ignorant people of the day, who have no share of the radiance of the divine beauty, make certain claims, and in every age and cycle inflict upon the people of the ocean of divine unity what they themselves deserve. If God could chastise men for their perverse doings, he would not leave upon the earth a moving thing, but to an appointed time doth he respite them. So this is how it is that that conflict appears upon the earth, and it is this inability to see the oneness behind the different forms, and that also veils people from being able to see that each of these valleys represents a correct view of the world within its own state. Baha'u'llah is not, in describing these valleys, and he makes this point even more clearly in other of his mystical works, in describing different stages, he's not saying some of these are error and some of these are truth. These are all relative degrees of truth, which is a very different way of looking at religious truth than perhaps we're traditionally used to thinking. We're used to thinking of religious truth as a zero-sum game. Either it's true or false, and there's one truth and many falsehoods, and that's what leads to the conflict and contention in the world. If there can only be one truth and everything else has to be falsehood, then only one religion can be true and all the others have to be false. But if it's a matter of light shining through different cultures, through different peoples at different times in different ways, and thus producing this rainbow of different expressions of the human encounter with the divine, then one is no longer in the position of having to justify one of these colors, one of these expressions, to the exclusion of all the rest. Now you might ask, well, surely Baha'u'llah is saying, well, some of these are closer to the truth. Well, isn't love closer to the truth than search? Isn't unity closer than knowledge, and so forth? Isn't this a hierarchy of stages of realization? So isn't this then hiding a kind of elitist view in which one can say, everything is true in its own way, but really my truth is better than your truth because I'm at this level of understanding while you're at that level of understanding. And is that what Baha'u'llah is saying here? Is he inviting us into a way of looking at the world in which we ourselves put ourselves in a sort of higher spiritual category than others because we see that, well, we're seeing things through the lens of unity and you guys are seeing things through the degree of separation, and yes, your way of looking at it is true in its own way, but really that's kind of the child's truth, and my way is like the adult version of the truth. Is that where we're being invited to go? And I submit that the answer is no. And part of that is because we ourselves never really know what station we're in.
Oh, yeah.
And to make that kind of assessment of ourselves is quite a dangerous thing. So dangerous, in fact, that in Gems of Divine Mysteries, Baha'u'llah, at the very end, describes and issues this dire warning to the seekers, saying, the seeker, if they having reached the end of the goal, if there should enter into their heart the least trace of pride and vainglory, they will at that very moment be returned to the first stage of the journey without realizing it. So there's always that danger that having this idea in oneself that one is in a superior spiritual position than others because I'm in this valley and you're in valley or something like that is a very spiritually dangerous thing.
That puts you in separation anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Throws you definitely out of unity, doesn't it?
And that also, it also creates disunity because you can't hide, if you really feel that you're superior than someone else, you can't hide that by saying, well, it's all just variations of color on the truth.
But if you say Baha'u'llah, or what Baha'u'llah says is the truth,
Mm-hmm.
to me there's no really gray area. He either is what he says he is or he is not.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that you say the others are, you're able to say, well, see all of those lights in there?
Mm-hmm.
They're all light.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't say that, you wouldn't have known
Mm-hmm.
light from darkness.
And when Baha'u'llah describes his own revelation in his Book of Laws, he says, this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. He describes it as an eternal truth. He doesn't try to differentiate it as being higher than the truths of the past. It's the changeless faith of God. that's the eye that he's inviting us to see through, which is fundamentally an eye of unity, not an eye that will separate and divide and categorize. What about, maybe we can ask whether we can look at modern physics as a way of looking at this sort of problem, because there are, for example, two different ways of describing a system. Let's say a system on the large scales of planets and suns and so forth. One can look at it through the lens of Newtonian physics, and one can look at it through the lens of general relativity. Newtonian physics being several centuries earlier, much simpler mathematically, actually quite accurate as far as it goes, unless you're trying to describe the physics of black holes or trying to describe the very first moments of the universe, then Newtonian physics is actually a pretty good way of describing things. You might say, well, general relativity is more correct than Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is an approximation or a simpler version of a truer reality. But what ultimately is, if you're trying to do something in the world, if you're trying to build something useful, you're trying to build an airplane or a highway, or grade a highway, or build a satellite, are you going to use Newtonian physics or are you going to use general relativity? You're actually going to use Newtonian physics for almost any application in the world. So which is more true? You can say in some abstract way that general relativity is a fuller, more nuanced expression of gravity, but in almost any daily use that you can think of, Newtonian physics is just as accurate and actually far simpler, better by sort of any definition of the word. So, is it a fair comparison to say that there are also certain spiritual realities which you can say, yeah, technically, to look at it, say, through the lens of the eye of true poverty and absolute nothingness, the sort of the uttermost valley is the most nuanced way of looking at creation. But in practice, we get by through the valleys of distinction. In practice, those are our Newtonian approximations, and they're a way of looking at the world which has also its own use. Could this be a way of looking at truth which is not exclusive, which is not a zero-sum game, but which is additive? In other words, one doesn't have to deny one of these formulations of gravity to affirm the other. One sees these are both perfectly correct within their sphere of application. Similarly, one doesn't have to deny different ways of looking at the divine and different expressions of the which are characteristic of the different valleys by having to somehow negate one in order to affirm the other. So in this sense, we can say that spiritual truths are additive rather than exclusive. But that's the problem of religion in the world today, and that's the source of conflict in the world today, is that virtually everyone thinks theologically when it comes to religious ideas, when it comes to our deepest beliefs and intuitions about how the world works, whether there is a God, how this God interacts with the universe, through which human vehicle that interaction has taken place, and so forth. The world is stuck in this mode of mutual exclusivity. It's stuck in this idea that one of these truths, only one of these truths can be true. Only one of these paths can be true, and it's an exclusive of all of the other paths. And this is where Baha'u'llah, throughout the Seven Valleys and in all of these mystical paths, is inviting us into a different way of looking at reality, in which truths are not mutually exclusive. And he's inviting us to apply these insights that the individual path of the spiritual seeker reaches as they traverse the valleys. He's inviting us to apply these sorts of insights at a higher level, to think about the religious experience of the human race in similar terms, and inviting us to see through the eye of unity in a non-exclusive way, according to the principle of the relativity of religious truth. So this takes us to paragraph 43. So having described how it is that this conflict appears in the world, he has to give us a few hints as to how to get to this valley, and paragraph 43 is one of those hints. He says, "O my brother, a pure heart is as a mirror. Cleanse it with the burnish of love and severance from all save God, that the true sun may shine therein and the eternal morning dawn. Then wilt thou clearly see the meaning of earth and heaven cannot contain me. What can alone contain me is the heart of him that hath believed in me. And thou wilt take up thy life in thy hand, and with infinite longing cast it before thy newly found beloved." So the burnish of love and severance are two of the keys to getting here. And then Baha'u'llah describes the state of the seeker in this valley, and gives, I think, an interesting metaphor for something which one might call manifest spirituality. It says when the seeker reaches this point, it becomes visible. Here's how he says it. He says, "Whensoever the light of the revelation of the King of Oneness settleth upon the throne of the heart and soul, his radiance becometh visible in every limb and member. At that time the mystery of the famed tradition gleameth out of the darkness. A servant is drawn unto me in prayer until I answer him. And when I have answered him, I become the ear wherewith he heareth. For thus the master of the house hath appeared within his home, and all the pillars of the dwelling are ashine with his light. And as the action and effect of the light are from the light giver, so it is that all move through him and arise by his will. This is that wellspring whereof the near ones drink, as it is said, a fount whereof they who are drawn nigh to God shall drink." Now, I don't think Baha'u'llah is describing literally halos and lights and so forth, but he is describing a spiritual state which is visible. Abdu'l-Baha would say that the eyes are the mirrors of the soul. One can look into someone's eyes and see what's there. You can't hide it. You can't hide your light under a bushel. There's a tablet called the Tablet to the Aunt that Abdu'l-Baha wrote, and it was his aunt at the time was a supporter of Mirza Yahya, the half brother of Baha'u'llah, who had really turned against him. And Abdu'l-Baha is arguing that to tell the truth of the matter, all you have to do is look at him. All you have to do is see the bearing and countenance, because that's where the spiritual reality is there, sort of on the surface, to be picked up. And he says it in the following way in this tablet. He says, "Were one to observe matters with but scant attention, the rank and station of every soul could be plainly read from his conduct and bearing. Wert thou to consider the motion and stillness, the merits and attainments, the exaltation and abasement of the souls, and to examine their conduct and bearing, the inner reality of every soul would become clear and evident, and no need would remain for any further proof or evidence." It's a little bit scary to me, because it takes what we might have thought was our secret balance in our hidden bank account, which is our spirituality, which no one can see, which is a hidden thing, and it totally puts it on the outside. There are no hidden spiritual bank accounts. If you've got money in the bank, if you have the spiritual attainment, it's there to be seen. Otherwise, it's not a real spiritual attainment. That's a little bit. I don't know. Maybe am I taking this too far? Is the analogy the wrong analogy? But it does, I think.
It almost seems like it can be hidden from ourselves, though.
I think we can hide it from ourselves very, very clearly.
Yeah.
And I think that those who are more spiritually developed than oneself can certainly see you clearly. But the ones who are not as developed cannot. So one doesn't have to worry at all. Just know that you're not hidden.
Yeah.
But that concept still is relative. I mean, that causes judgment. Like saying spirituality, there is no such a concept.
That's a great point. Is this inviting us to judge others? Saying, well, spiritual.
Is for us to look within ourselves, not to judge others. Because we're clearly not supposed to judge others.
Clearly.
If we go down that path, we've
Yeah.
gone
We've
down.
gone.
Yes.
Yes.
But in
But
a
also-
sense, it would make one forgiving. Just, well, that person he hasn't had the chance, he doesn't understand. It's all right. He's fine. You're fine. But call oneself to account. Golly, you do that. And you think, we've had these teachings all these years. Some people have brought up in the faith. We've had it since childhood. But I have had the opportunity to read these teachings since 1951. And why don't I know a lot better or act a lot better?
You're fine.
And I always
Yeah.
say that you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
You probably know more than you think you know.
Well, a lot of times we don't do what we know.
Yeah.
At least I find one.
But we also carry some ancestral baggage too.
Mm.
Of things that we've carried from our ancestors
Mm.
that we don't know. It could be that the ants walked a lot farther than the man. You know what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
were steps, but they've gone a lot farther for them.
Yeah.
This has
Well-
raised another question for me, though. How about the periodic table? The atoms.
Yes.
To go back to the atoms.
Yes.
There are different atoms.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What's the question? There are different atoms.
What's the question?
So we're all made of atoms.
Yes.
And human beings are going to be made of primarily the same atoms, although we have different diets and
Yes.
so on. But the atom has the capacity to grow, to synchronize and change.
Yes. The atom, it's a funny thing about how the universe is constructed, that the fundamental building blocks are not infinite in their number, but there's only a few building blocks. As many atoms as there are elements in the periodic table, even those are built upon a very small number of building blocks. Your electrons, your protons, your neutrons. And your protons and neutrons are based on still more fundamental elements. And we don't know how deep that rabbit hole goes yet. But all the diversity that we see is a result of combinations of those fundamental building blocks.
Then you get to DNA.
Yes, and then
that
you have
seems
this.
to be
Yes,
all
and you have
life.
near infinite diversity being built upon that fundamentally simple building block of just a few base pairs. And the principle that I take from this, which I find really fascinating, is that each configuration of relatively simple building blocks into more complex groupings unlocks something which was there in potential. Configuration was able to appear in a particular degree of complexity. So, at the level of the individual atoms of the periodic table, you're never going to see growth and life and development, and unless you reach the level of the human being with the complexity of our brains, presumably you're not going to have the further potentialities of consciousness emerging. And taking that to the next level, that also gives us a vision for where we're going into the future, because what we're doing now, what we're in the process of doing now on the planet worldwide, is creating that first configuration of beings on the planet, of human beings which are knitted together into a social fabric which is cohesive and which is not split up into tribes and nations and religions and classes and so forth, which are fundamentally disconnected from each other. But we're in the process of knitting together for the first time a new kind of planet. We have no idea what emerges. If you see what almost magical things emerge from the coming together of elements in the human frame and this turning on of this light of consciousness, what is going to emerge when you have 7 billion plus people on the planet that finally come together in a coherent way, in a way that fundamentally is cooperative rather than competitive. What's going to emerge then? What sort of capacities are going to manifest themselves? What sort of civilization? I'm sure we just can't imagine it. We can sit here and try to imagine it, and great science fiction writers do. Maybe are in that way a bit of our eyes and ears in trying to imagine that. And of course, the prophets are our eyes and ears in trying to imagine what a future state of society would be. But it all emerges from these from this coming together of things which are at a lower level, more simple. So Baha'u'llah is describing this spirituality that emerges on the surface. It's visible on the surface, but he warns us that we're not to see that light shining from every limb and member. That we're not to mistake that for a descent of the essence of God itself into the state of being. And that's the warning he issues on paragraph 45, where he says, "Let none construe these utterances to imply the incarnation or descent of the worlds of God into the grades of his creatures, nor should they lead thine eminence to such misapprehensions, for God in his essence is sanctified above all ascent and descent, egress and regress. He hath throughout all eternity been exalted beyond the attributes of his creation, and will ever remain so. No man hath ever known him, no soul hath ever fathomed the nature of his being. In the valley of his knowledge every mystic wandereth astray, in the comprehension of his essence every saint standeth bewildered. Sanctified is he above the understanding of the wise, exalted is he beyond the knowledge of the knowing. The way is barred and all seeking rejected. His proof is his signs, his evidence, his being. Wherefore the lovers of the countenance of the beloved have said, O thou whose essence alone can lead to his essence, and who transcendeth all likeness to his creatures, how can utter nothingness spur its charger in the arena of eternity, or a fleeting shadow reach to the everlasting sun? The friend addressed by the words, but for thee, hath said, we have failed to know thee. And the beloved alluded to by the words, or even closer, hath said, nor attain thy presence. And these are all snippets of references to passages in the Quran. So all of this is saying there's this rift, there's a between us and this degree of ultimate reality, which in the West we call God. But therefore, when we talk about God, all the references we have to God, the reference point is not that ultimate layer of reality that if we even try to reach it, we'll end up missing the mark. But ultimately, the reference point then is something tangible in the world, which Baha'is call the manifestations of God. And this is the point that Baha'u'llah makes in the next paragraph. He says, indeed, the references that have been made to the degrees of mystic knowledge pertain to the knowledge of the effulgences of that Sun of Truth as it becometh reflected in various mirrors. That is, the manifestations and everything beyond and everything below them in that hierarchy of existence. And the effulgence of that light is present within the hearts, yet it is hidden beneath the veils of selfish desires and earthly attachments, even as a candle within a lantern of iron, and only when the cover is lifted doth the light of the candle shine out. In like manner, when thou dost strip the veils of illusion from the face of thy heart, the lights of oneness will be made manifest. It is clear then that even these rays are not subject to egress or regress, how much less that essence of existence and longed-for mystery. O my brother, consider these matters in the spirit of enquiry, not in blind imitation. A true wayfarer will not be deterred by the impediment of words, nor daunted by the sway of insinuations. How can a curtain part the lover from his love when Alexander's wall cannot keep them apart? Secrets are many and strangers are myriad. Volumes will not suffice to hold the mystery of the beloved, nor can it be exhausted in these pages, though it be no more than a word, no more than a sign. Knowledge is one point which the foolish have multiplied. And then Baha'u'llah continues by giving us 3 examples of how the single point of knowledge gets multiplied. And these 3 examples are, he gives an example of how time has been thought of in 4 different ways, how the heaven and different degrees of existence have been thought of in 4 different ways, and how the pathways of love have been thought of in 4 different ways. So he gives each of these and just mentions them, doesn't even get into the details. He sort of mentions them and says, I really don't even want to mention this because it can lead astray from the point. But it's interesting that he does mention them, because elsewhere in his writings they are developed with more detail. But it's interesting how in what manner he introduces them here, because he's not saying that these are necessarily foundational ways of looking at the world, but perhaps, as with other things, if it's useful to break things up in this way, fine. But ultimately, there's a higher vision that one can see through, which is this vision of unity, in which all of these ways of dividing are just a way of multiplying one's ignorance. Yeah.
Sorry, and in the previous translation, did it say which the ignorant would multiply? And if so, is that a change from the last translation to this translation, and is there significance in that?
Yeah, was it ignorant in the last? I can't remember.
When I heard you say foolish, that.
Oh, in my mind,
I'm
no, but it does say foolish.
It does say
foolish.
I was
Yeah.
Did that change, and if so?
I can't remember. I don't have the original on me, so I can't check unless any of the Persian friends who have read it in the original know offhand. It's a hadith, I believe, and it escapes my recollection what the original word is.
In fact,
but
the last time I checked was following with your readings, it just certain words have been uplifted in translations.
Yeah.
And it's really
quite yeah. So I'm not sure, but certainly the two are closely related. And so Baha'u'llah gives these three examples: the example of the world of time, and the world of duration, and the world of primordial reality, and the world of eternity, where something either has a beginning and an end, or no beginning and no end, and so forth. And he immediately says, although there are many differing statements as to these points, to recount them in detail would result in weariness. So he just sort of skips over it. And then he mentions also this idea of the heavenly court and the celestial dominion, the divine kingdom, and mortal existence. In the original translation, it gave the original Persian words for it, Lahut and Jabarut and Malakut and Nasut, which are actually quite commonly found in the Baha'i writings, which can be mapped onto the ringstone symbol, can be mapped onto this threefold cosmology of the Baha'i writings. But Baha'u'llah doesn't dwell on it here. And then he immediately passes on to describing these four stations of love, which we talked about either in the first or second week. From the creatures to the true one, from the true one to the creatures, from the creatures to the creatures, and from the true one to the true one. And it's a useful way of thinking about how this one light, this one reign of the divine will, this one force of attraction can be manifested in different ways depending on how one looks at it. But Baha'u'llah here is emphasizing rather that there's a unity behind all of these. And then he says, to emphasize this point, that there's many utterance of the sages and mystics of former times, which I have not mentioned here, since I mislike copious citations from the sayings of the past. For quotation from the words of others betokeneth acquired learning and not divine bestowal. Even so much as I have quoted here is out of deference to the wont of men and after the manner of the learned. Further, such matters are beyond the scope of this epistle. My unwillingness to recount their sayings is not from pride, rather it is the manifestation of wisdom and the revelation of bounty. If Khazr did wreck the vessel on the sea, 1,000 rights are in this wrong concealed. And the story of Khazr is from the Quran. It's a very interesting story. And Khazr is a very shadowy and odd figure. Is not even named in the Quran. It's later traditions that give him this name, Khazr, which literally means green. And the story, and it's interesting also because there aren't that many actual connected stories in the Quran. There's the story of Joseph, Surah 12 in the Quran, and then there's this story of Khazr, which is that basically Moses meets this being who is, you can think of him as a kind of an angel. He's one of the beings that executes the will of God on the earth. And Moses says to him, can I hang out with you and just sort of see how you do your work? And he says, no, Chezr says to Moses, no, you won't have the patience, you won't really understand what I'm doing. And Moses basically convinces him, and it comes along with Chezr. And he recounts in 3 episodes. And in the first episode, Chezr comes up to a boat that's sailing on the river, and he sinks the boat. And Moses said, why did you do that? And he says, no, you promised me you wouldn't ask me any questions. Just, And Moses said, okay, I won't talk. So they go on to the next thing. And Chezr comes up to a young man and just kills him out of nowhere. And Moses says, "What? You're not supposed to just kill people. What's going on here?" And Chezr said, "No questions." And so they go on to the next scene, and there's a wall that's about to fall over, and a dilapidated old wall that's really not part of any structure, and Chezr fixes the wall, and Moses is like, "Come on, you got to tell me what's going on." And Chezr says, "Look, this is where our paths part, but let me explain to you what's going on." He says, I sunk the boat because Pharaoh's army was coming through and requisitioning all the boats on the river. And by scuttling the boat, I saved it for its owner, because he could always raise it up later, and then the boat wouldn't have been stolen. And as to that young man, he was going to grow up and become a very evil person and do very bad things, and be very unfaithful to his parents. And so I was doing his parents and the world a favor, basically. And as to the wall, he says that wall hid a treasure. A treasure was buried under that wall. That was the inheritance of a pair of orphans. And by fixing the wall, I was enabling that inheritance to be passed on to them in later years. And so the point is that God's ways are mysterious, and there's ultimately a point to things. And Baha'u'llah just references that story here and saying that maybe what I'm doing won't make sense to you, but trust that there's wisdom behind behind the apparent nonsense. Then he says, otherwise the servant regardeth himself as utterly lost and non-existent, even before one of the beloved of God, how much less in the presence of his holy ones. Glorified be my Lord the Most High. Moreover, our aim is to recount the stages of the wayfarer's journey, not to set forth the conflicting utterances of the mystics. And then he goes on to describe in more detail in the next 2 paragraphs the idea of the beginning and the end. And I suspect that what he's doing here is laying some groundwork for what he later does in the Kitab-i-Igan in much more detail, which is making the point. And I think I brought this up when he brought up the beginning and the end earlier, that Baha'u'llah has to solve this theological conundrum of how it is that almost all Muslims universally believe that Muhammad was the final prophet, the seal of the prophets, the last prophet. And Baha'u'llah is arguing in the 7 Valleys that our idea of firstness is one of those ideas, particularly as it pertains to prophets, that one can reach a point where one transcends that and realizes that they're all the first and they're all the last. And so when Muhammad said he was the seal of the prophets, he was at the same time the first prophet, and likewise Baha'u'llah is the seal and likewise the first, because all attributes pertain to them. So he describes this in the next 2 paragraphs about how, in relation, for instance, to your son, you are the first, but in relation to your father, you are the last. And so the idea of firstness and lastness is relative to one's position. And since we're running out of time, I won't read through these paragraphs in detail. But that's the basic point is summed up in the last sentence in paragraph 56, where he says, "In this realm, the first is the same as the last, and the last is the same as the first." So what's internal, external, and first and last, all of these ideas become relativized. He says, "O my friend, look to thyself. Hadst thou not become a father and become a son, neither wouldst thou have comprehended these words. Now forget them one and all, that thou mayest learn from the Master of Love in the schoolhouse of divine unity, mayest return unto God, forsake the land of unreality for thy true station, and dwell beneath the shadow of the tree of knowledge. O thou dear one, impoverish thyself, that thou mayest enter the lofty court of riches, and humble thy body, that thou mayest drink from the stream of glory and attain to the full meaning of the poems whereof thou hadst asked. again, giving a key to the attainment of these values is a sort of a lowering of oneself, an opening of one's heart to higher realities. And this sounds a lot like what Baha'u'llah describes in the Persian hidden words. O son of dust, blind thine eyes that thou mayest behold my beauty. Stop thine ears that thou mayest hearken unto the sweet melody of my voice. Empty thyself of all learning, that thou mayest partake of my knowledge, and sanctify thyself from riches, that thou mayest obtain a lasting share from the ocean of my eternal wealth. Blind thine eyes, that is, to all save my beauty. Stop thine ears to all save my word. Empty thyself of all learning, save the knowledge of me, that with a clear vision, a pure heart, and an attentive ear thou mayest enter the court of my holiness. Thus, he goes on to say, it hath been made clear that these stages depend on the attainment of the wayfarer. In every city he will behold a world, in every valley reach a spring, in every meadow hear a song. But the falcon of the mystic heaven hath many a wondrous carol of the spirit in its breast, and the Persian bird keepeth in its soul many a sweet Arabian melody. Yet these are hidden, and hidden shall remain. If I speak forth, many a mind will shatter, and if I write, many a pen will break. Quite possibly also Baha'u'llah alluding to what still remains concealed within his breast, in which, in accordance with the principle of progressive revelation, which is a principle that applies from one dispensation to the next, it also applies within a given dispensation. Baha'u'llah gradually reveals through the course of his ministry the truths that he first encounters in the Siyat Shal. And Abdu'l-Baha also puts this in beautiful terms, where he says that the sun of truth, when it rises, is just like the real sun. It rises gradually from the horizon, and that if it appeared in the full brightness and heat of its noontide glory, then it would damage the earth and living things. There's a wisdom of things appearing and disappearing in a gradual manner, which also, by the way, I think underlies the wisdom of the Baha'i practice of burying of the dead, as opposed to cremation. There's a organic gradualness by which things come into being and through which things pass out of being, and that somehow maintains the connections along the chain of being, that things happen according to these gradual processes. Peace be upon him who concludeth this exalted journey and followeth the way of truth by the lights of guidance. So that concludes the Valley of Unity. And next week we won't meet because we're off that week, but we'll return in 2 weeks to the valley or city here of contentment.
And to answer Kelly's question, yes, the previous translation said knowledge is a single point, but the ignorant have multiplied it.
Yeah.
Could you go back to page 31, where it says, if God should chastise men for their perverse doings, he would not leave upon the earth a moving thing. But then the next sentence, I'd like to have you please explain.
Oh, but to an appointed time doth he respite them.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
Well, it's almost as though the just recompense for our collective actions is being delayed. You know, there's a grace period.
So until we get there?
And we're still in that grace period, perhaps. That's a big question that no one knows the answer to, but certainly Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi all seem to anticipate a universal convulsion of some sort that would be a cleansing process, also a process by which perhaps that breaks through the crust of old ways of thinking and that enables new ways of thinking to emerge. Like the wildfires that have to pass through the forests occasionally, and it's part of the process of the forest maintaining its health. Otherwise, the underbrush never gets cleared away. And that's one way of understanding, I guess, in natural terms, what Baha'u'llah is alluding to here, which can be described also in terms of God's vengeance or God's retributive justice as a result of the sins of the world. One can also think of it in very natural and organic terms as, for the great trees to take seed and to grow, it requires there to be periodic cleansings of the forest, periodic fires that have to sweep through and clean away the useless underbrush. Yeah.
Regarding what you were saying about the seal of the prophet and getting by, what you're saying, versus the deeper understanding. When I've encountered the issue around the seal of the prophet, I've emphasized that there is the age of prophecy and the age of fulfillment, and that the splitting point was that Muhammad was the end of the age of prophecy. So he was the seal of the prophets, and then we are now in the age of fulfillment, beginning it with Baha'u'llah, and that will go on for ages and ages, I suppose. And so that's how I've done it. But maybe that's just the getting by version. The deeper version is what you said today, which is every prophet or every manifestation isn't end, it's a beginning, just like father to a son, and a son to a grandson, and so forth and so on.
That's a good way of putting it, because I've heard Baha'is describe that also, that Muhammad was a seal of a cycle, and then Baha'u'llah inaugurates a new cycle. And that makes a lot of sense, except that Baha'u'llah never says that. He himself doesn't give that explanation. That's an explanation that others have given later to explain how Muhammad could be able to seal the prophets. When Baha'u'llah explains the seal of the prophets, he explains it in the terms that are kind of presaged in the Seven Valleys, that he just relativizes the whole idea of firstness and lastness.
Well, and it's in the Bible too. Jesus said, "I am
the Alpha and the Omega." Yeah.
The first and the last, the beginning and the end. So.
Yep.
You could tell that to people in Islam, and it seems like that would be because if Christ was saying, "I'm the end," then there would be no way for Muhammad to come.
Yeah. Yep.
I kind of like to think about at the time that these things were revealed, writing that was authentic was sealed with the personal seal of the person who had written it, like Baha'u'llah stamped his writings with his seal. Well, all of them, of course, had the seal. But their word was it. Unfortunately, we don't have much actual word from Revelations before Muhammad.
Baha'u'llah also revealed in, I think it's Advent of Divine Justice, but at one point I was beheaded, and then at that time I was crucified, and then another time I was describes Muhammad's situation, that he was the one who had, and then another time riddled with bullets, meaning the bomb, and then so as it was mentioned before, is their physical person is different, but they are all the same.
It's so nice to know that, isn't it?
Isn't that interesting?
All right.
In the context of the varying types of unity,
Right. And so we'll start touching on other types of unity in the weeks to come, and some of them are really briefly described in the last of the valleys, but in other of the works we get even more details. So they all speak to each other.
Is the valley of contentment progression from the valley of unity?
That's a great question. So we'll deal with that 2 weeks from now. We'll ask that question 2 weeks from now. Yeah.
So for a practical application, everything that appears to be destructive that we're seeing right now, we should see as a sign of God, and that this is a good thing.
That's right.
You can see it in those. You can see it in those terms. Yeah. But that's, I think, part of what I think we're invited to do is in works like the Seven Valleys is that you can look at it as this is the retribution of God. You can also look at it as this is the sort of natural process of, burning away the underbrush. And the two are ultimately the same. They're two sides of the same coin, whether one sees things through a kind of natural agency or one sees things as in other words, as a top-down or as a bottom-up. Looking at the world through a top-down lens or a bottom-up lens is ultimately an equivalent way of looking at the world.
It's pretty hard to argue with Mother Nature. She's going to win.
Yeah.
If we work the planet in a certain way, it's not going to work in the long run.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Actually, tying 2 or 3 of the points that you've made throughout your talk here. The first point was that you mentioned that should we think that we hold most truth within our belief, and we look at others as childlike perceptions. And then you talked about attributes of God being present in, for example, a tree. So many attributes are present within that reality. And then I was reminded of the quotation. Now, I often thought about this quotation because the quotation that says, within the reality of each thing, he has manifested one of his attributes, but within the reality of man, he has manifested all of his attributes and made it a mirror of his own self. Now, I often think, why did he say one of his attributes when clearly everything has
many? Yeah.
But perhaps there he is asking us to look even at a lower level, species or whatever you want to call it, at its most elemental level and see truth. So, in a way, would you say that quotation reflects the belief in unity that we see in each belief present certain degrees of truth, even at its most elemental level? It just struck to me, I kind of made the connection between everything that you said and that quotation came to my mind. And it made sense to me.
I don't know. It's also possible that even though every individual reflects a multitude of attributes to varying degrees, that a particular attribute is dominant. Maybe that's an element of it as well.
But the attributes in man are up to one's own endeavor.
Yeah.
The capacities, you have to work on them.
Yeah.
It reminds me
All right. Yes.
Comment. I think I mentioned to you that, Baha'u'llah speaks Tao, in the way that it's the same mythical path where the further we evolve, the greater the hidden need, or the greater the deeper unconscious desire to return back to the source. Is that we can't go far. The leaf never cannot separate and break out from the tree. Eventually, the tree needs the leaves, and the leaves need the tree. So is that we think that we can find salvation through emanation, but then we feel this psychic spiritual thirst to want to return from where we came from at the same time. So the attributes that Baha'u'llah was talking about mankind is that right there. As we become more and more caught up with form, there's this fire that wants to return to that psycho-spiritual self.
Thank you. That's a great point to end on.